In September of 1988, a 38-year-old woman named Sally D. Hudson stood in a red dirt cemetery outside Elkmont, Alabama, watching them lower her husband into the ground. And the only thing she could think about, beside the fact that Ray was gone and she'd never hear his voice calling from the back porch again, was a number. $50,000. $50,000. That's what Ray owed when he died. $50,000 in equipment loans for a John Deere 4240 he financed in 1985, and a pull-type combine he bought the following year. Convinced that modern machinery would finally push their 240-acre cotton operation into something that could last, Ray had been 43 years old when a stroke took him in a half-disked field on a Tuesday afternoon in September. Probably pushed there by stress and long hours and the quiet, suffocating pressure of trying to service loan payments in an agricultural economy that had already started bleeding out. Sally had 2 kids, Connie, 15, and James, 12. She had a farmhouse Ray's grandfather had built in 1911. She had 240 acres of Limestone County bottomland that had been in the Hudson family for 4 generations. And she had equipment debt that exceeded what the farm earned in an entire year. The bank had been sympathetic at the funeral. 9 days later, they were less sympathetic and more direct. She had time to figure out the payments, but not much time. If she couldn't make them, the bank would repossess the equipment, and if the auction didn't cover the balance, they'd come for the land to cover the difference. What Sally Hudson did next, how she kept that farm alive and paid off $50,000 of debt in 4 years, became one of the most remarkable stories Limestone County had seen in a generation. And it started with a decision that every person she trusted to meet her was a mistake. Welcome back to American Farm Tales. If this is your first time here, this channel exists to preserve the stories of real farming families, the hard decisions, the impossible years, and the people who found a way through anyway. If that matters to you, hit subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it keeps these stories alive. Now, before I tell you what Sally Hudson did with that old Farmall, you need to understand the man she was trying to hold on for. Ray Hudson was not a reckless farmer. That is the first thing anyone who knew him will tell you. He wasn't a gambler. He wasn't careless with money. He was a man who looked at the numbers in front of him, made a reasonable calculation, and got the timing wrong. In farming, that's often all it takes. Ray had inherited the operation from his father, Earl Hudson, who had worked those 240 acres of Limestone County bottomland since the early 1950s. When Earl bought a used 1961 Farmall 450 from a retiring neighbor down the road, it was a sound machine for what the farm needed. It ran, it worked, it was paid for. Ray grew up on that tractor. He knew every rattle and rhythm of it. And when he took over the farm in the late 1970s, the Farmall was still in the equipment shed, still serviceable, still doing the job. But by 1985, the cotton market was moving. Prices had climbed through the mid-decade, and the rally looked, from where Ray was standing, like it had legs. Other farmers in Limestone County were upgrading. The agricultural lenders were enthusiastic. The pitch was simple, and it made sense on paper. Bigger equipment meant you could work more ground. More ground meant more cotton. More cotton at these prices meant the loan paid for itself inside of 3 years. Ray financed a John Deere 4240 in 1985. $46,000. 8% interest over 7 years. The following year, he added a pull-type combine, $22,000 financed over 5 years. His total equipment debt climbed to just over $68,000. His combined annual payment was approximately $1,050 per month. On a farm netting $28,000 in a good year, that was tight but workable. If the prices held and the weather cooperated, neither did. 1987 brought softening prices. 1988 brought drought. Yields dropped 30%. Cotton revenue fell well short of projections. Ray's net income before equipment payments was somewhere around $14,000. After payments, he was underwater by nearly $4,000. He covered it by cutting everything he could and saying nothing. Sally found out how bad it really was after the funeral. Going through his desk, she found a yellow legal pad in the bottom drawer. 2 columns of numbers in Ray's handwriting, neat and precise. the version he showed her, and the version he hadn't. Outstanding equipment debt, $50,400. She sat at the kitchen table with that legal pad for a long time. The numbers didn't lie. Ray had been carrying this alone, right up until he couldn't carry anything anymore. 9 days after they buried Ray Hudson, a clean white truck pulled into the farmyard and parked near the equipment shed. Dennis Harwell was the agricultural loan officer at First Farmers Bank in Athens. He was a trim man in his mid-40s, polite in the way that people are polite when they have practiced delivering bad news enough times to get smooth at it. He knocked at the back door, not the front. Sally let him in. She offered coffee. He declined, which told her something. A man who declines coffee at a farmhouse kitchen table has already decided he isn't staying long. He set a folder on the table and opened it without theater. Outstanding balance on the John Deere 4240 note, $31,800. Outstanding balance on the combine note, $18,600. Combined total, $50,400. Combined monthly payment, $1,050. He said the bank understood this was an extremely difficult time and that they had genuine sympathy for her situation. Then he said the payments needed to continue. Sally asked what happened if they didn't. Dennis looked at the folder rather than at her. The bank would be required to explore other options, he said. Repossession of the equipment. Sale at public auction. If the auction proceeds didn't cover the full balance, and in the current market, they very likely wouldn't, the bank would need to secure the deficiency against other assets. He paused. Against the land. Sally looked at him for a moment. She said, quietly and without heat, that this land had been in Ray's family since 1904, that her children were the 5th generation to live on it, that she was not selling it. Dennis nodded. He looked genuinely uncomfortable, which she gave him credit for. Then the payments need to continue, Mrs. Hudson, he said. Are you going to be able to do that? Sally had no idea. The honest answer was that she didn't know how she was going to plant a crop, raise 2 children, and find $1,050 every month out of a farm that hadn't cleared that in net income over its last 2 months combined. She didn't say any of that. She said, I'll find a way. Dennis closed the folder, thanked her for her time, and was back in his clean truck and down the driveway inside of 20 minutes. Sally sat at the kitchen table. She pulled Ray's yellow legal pad in front of her and set it next to the bank folder and looked at both of them together. The farm's best recent year had netted $28,000 before equipment payments. The equipment payments alone ran $12,600 annually. That left $15,400 before seed, before fertilizer, before fuel, before property taxes, before groceries, before anything else a family of 3 needed to survive a year. And 1988 had not been a best year. It had been close to the worst. The math did not work. She went over it twice more, looking for something she had missed. There was nothing to find. The math simply did not work. The next morning there was a knock at the back door. Earl Briggs was 68 years old, retired from the county extension office after nearly 3 decades of advising farmers across Limestone County on everything from soil chemistry to equipment financing. Before that, he had farmed the 180 acres adjacent to the Hudson place for 40 years, until his youngest son took it over in the mid-80s. He had known Ray Hudson since Ray was 11 years old. He had watched Ray grow up on that Farmall, watched him take over from his father, watched him make the equipment decisions that Sally was now inheriting the consequences of. He came to the back door, not the front. He was carrying a brown paper sack with a pound of coffee and a covered dish his wife had sent over. His wife came in, set things on the counter, said a few kind words to Sally, and left. Earl sat down at the kitchen table. He looked at the yellow legal pad still sitting there from the night before. He didn't ask about it. He said, Sally, those equipment payments are going to take you under. I've watched it happen to better farmers than either of us, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend otherwise. Sally told him she didn't have a choice. The payments were there. The bank had made that clear. Earl shook his head. You have a choice, he said. It's not a good choice. It's going to hurt and it's going to look bad and people in this county are going to have opinions about it. But you have one. Sell the John Deere equipment, both pieces. Take whatever the market gives you, apply it to the loans, and negotiate with the bank to restructure whatever's left at a payment you can actually make. Then farm with what you've already got. Sally looked at him. She said, "The Farmall?" Earl nodded once. "The 1961 Farmall 450. It's sitting in your equipment shed right now. Has been for 4 years since Ray bought the John Deere. Ray's daddy maintained that tractor correctly his entire life, and Ray did too until he caught the upgrade fever. It's old. It's tired. But it's paid for, and paid for is what saves farms." Sally was quiet for a moment. Then she asked the question that had been sitting in her chest since Dennis Harwell left the day before. She asked it slowly because she was genuinely afraid of the answer. She said, "Can I actually farm 240 acres with that thing?" Earl looked down at his hands on the table. He was quiet long enough that Sally thought he might not answer. Then he looked back up at her. "It won't be easy," he said. "You'll work harder than Ray ever worked with the John Deere. And it'll take longer. And some days it's going to feel like it's not possible. But yes, farmers did it for decades with equipment like that. You can do it. And I'll show you how." They walked to the equipment shed the next morning in the gray October light, the kind of flat Alabama sky that gives nothing away about what the day intends to do. The Farmall 450 sat exactly where Ray had left it the day the John Deere arrived, 4 years earlier. It had not moved since. The rust-red paint had faded over time to something closer to the color of the dirt outside, dull and oxidized, the cream accent panels chipped and yellowed. Both front tires were flat, settled onto the rims. There was a film of dust across the hood thick enough to drag a finger through. A mud dauber had built a small nest in the gap between the hood and the fuel cap. The tractor looked like something that had been given up on. Earl walked around it slowly, the way a doctor moves around a patient he hasn't seen in a while. He checked things with his hands rather than his eyes, pressing on hoses, working the battery terminals back and forth, pulling the oil dipstick and holding it to the light from the shed door, checking the condition of the block for cracks. He didn't say much while he did it. When he finished the circuit, he stood at the front of the tractor and looked at it for a moment. "Ray's daddy maintained this machine the right way his whole life," Earl said. "Ray did too, right up until he got the upgrade fever. If the engine isn't seized, we can get it running." They spent 2 days on it. Earl drove to the parts house in Athens and came back with a new battery, filters, and a handful of small components. They drained the old fuel, which had gone to varnish in the tank, and put in fresh gas. They pulled the carburetor, cleaned it piece by piece on a rag spread across the hood, and reinstalled it. Changed the oil, checked every fluid, inflated the front tires with a compressor Earl brought from his barn. By the end of the second day, the tractor looked more or less the same, worn and faded and old. But everything that was supposed to move could move. On the third morning, Earl climbed into the seat and hit the starter. The engine turned over, slow and heavy, like something waking from a long sleep. It did not catch. Earl adjusted the choke and tried again. Still nothing. He waited a moment, then tried a third time. The engine turned and went quiet. He made a small adjustment Sally couldn't see and hit the starter a fourth time. It fired. A rough, clattering idle at first, uneven and loud in the shed. Then, over the course of the next 2 minutes, it smoothed. The clatter softened into a steady, even rhythm. The engine sat there and ran like it had somewhere to be. Sally stood in the shed doorway with her arms crossed and listened to it. She felt something shift in her chest. Not hope exactly. Not yet. But something close enough to it that she recognized the feeling. This machine still worked. It was old. Every surface of it showed the years. But it worked. Earl shut it down and looked at her from the seat. "Here's the plan," he said. The auction was held on a Saturday in early November, in a muddy field on the outskirts of Decatur. It had rained the night before, and the ground between the equipment rows had gone soft, and men in work boots moved through the lines in the cold morning air, kicking tires, running engines up and listening, writing numbers in small notebooks they kept in their shirt pockets. Dealers from Huntsville and Florence. Independent farmers looking to upgrade on someone else's misfortune. Equipment brokers who did this every weekend and felt nothing about it either way. Sally stood off to the side and watched. She had driven up alone that morning, before the kids were awake. She didn't tell Connie and James where she was going. She just left a note on the counter that said she'd be back by supper and drove north on 72 in the dark. She didn't know what she would feel watching it happen, and she didn't want to find out in front of her children. The John Deere 4240 went to a farm operation out of Morgan County. Ray had financed it 3 years ago for $46,000. It sold for $31,500. Sally watched the auctioneer's hand come down and heard the number called out and stood very still. The combine sold 40 minutes later for $26,000. Total proceeds, $57,500. After the auction house took its fees, the net applied to the loans came to just over $55,000. She drove to Athens on Monday morning and sat across from Dennis Harwell at First Farmers Bank. He applied the proceeds to both notes. Remaining balance after payoff, $14,200. He restructured it as a 4-year note at 11.5%. He slid the new payment schedule across the desk. Monthly payment, $238. Sally looked at that number for a long moment. Then she took out Ray's yellow legal pad from her bag. She had been carrying it with her since the funeral, like a document she needed to keep track of. And she did the math right there at Dennis Harwell's desk. Farm revenue in a poor year, somewhere between $28,000 and $32,000. Operating costs with minimal inputs, roughly $18,000. Equipment note, $2,856 annually. Property taxes, groceries, the things a family needed. The math worked. For the first time since she had found that legal pad in Ray's desk drawer, the numbers on the page did not produce an impossible answer. It was tight. There was nothing left over. A single bad break, equipment failure, a medical bill, a crop loss, and she would be in trouble. But the math worked. She thanked Dennis, folded the payment schedule into the legal pad, and drove home. The equipment shed was empty when she pulled into the yard. The John Deere was gone. The combine was gone. The only thing left inside was the Farmall 450, sitting in the far corner where Earl had parked it after they got it running. The tractor Ray's father had bought used before Sally was born was now the whole operation. She sat in the truck and looked at the shed for a while. Then she went inside to make supper for her kids. Earl Briggs was at the farm every morning before the sun came up. He had made that decision on his own, without being asked, and he arrived the same way every day. His truck in the yard before Sally's alarm went off, coffee already started if she wasn't down yet, boots on and ready to work. He was 68 years old, and his knees gave him trouble on cold mornings, but he was there. He taught her the way you teach someone who cannot afford to make a costly mistake. Slowly. Completely. With no detail treated as too small to explain. He showed her how to hitch implements to the Farmall's drawbar correctly, how to check the connection before she put load on it, how to set the throttle for field work versus moving between fields, how to read the engine temperature gauge and what it meant when the needle climbed. He taught her what the engine sounded like when it was working within its range and what it sounded like when she was asking too much of it. He showed her how to operate the 4-row planter she had rented from a neighbor 2 counties over, how to fill the seed boxes without waste, how to set the depth for the soil conditions in each field, how to watch the seed placement as the ground changed and make adjustments before a problem became a loss. Sally planted from first light until she could not see. The Farmall 450 produced 50 horsepower. The John Deere 4240 Ray had sold produced 130. There was no way to make up that difference except with hours. What a modern tractor covered in a full day took Sally 2.5. The math of it was simple and punishing. She accepted it and kept moving. Her back ached by noon every day. Her arms bruised along the forearms from wrestling the manual steering across rough ground, the kind of low-grade physical punishment that doesn't stop you but never fully lets up either. She came in after dark covered in red clay dust and diesel exhaust and ate whatever Connie had left on the stove, and she was asleep before 9 most nights, and she was up before 5 the next morning, and back out to the field. Connie and James rode out after school on their bikes with a cooler between them. Water, sandwiches, sometimes a piece of fruit. They didn't say much when they came. They were 15 and 12 years old, and they understood, in the way children understand things they aren't fully told, what was happening and what it required. They left the cooler in the shade at the field edge and rode home to do their homework. By the third week of December, all 240 acres were in the ground. Sally had gone over the seed budget 3 times before she ordered, cutting it back each time until she landed under $7,200. She used less fertilizer than Ray had in any recent year, betting on the residual fertility the soil had built up through years of proper rotation. Earl reviewed her input plan and said it was a reasonable gamble. Sally told him it wasn't a gamble. She just couldn't afford more than that, so that was what she used. Spring came in decent that year, which felt like the first thing that had gone in Sally's favor since September. She cultivated through April and May, pulling a rented row cultivator behind the Farmall, working the weeds down between the cotton rows before they could compete with the crop. It was slow work, the same as everything was slow at the Farmall. Methodical and repetitive and physical, in a way that left her tired in her hands by mid-afternoon. But the cotton was coming up even, and the stand looked reasonable. And reasonable was enough. The neighbors watched. Limestone County is the kind of place where people notice what you're doing and form opinions about it. And Sally Hudson was providing a good deal of material that spring. Some watched with quiet admiration. A woman alone on a 40-year-old tractor working 240 acres was not something the county had seen much of, and some people recognized it for what it was. Others watched with the particular brand of pity that small communities reserve for widows who appear to be trying too hard, who haven't yet accepted what everyone else can see plainly. A few thought she should have taken the insurance money, sold the land while it would still bring a fair price, and moved to Huntsville, where Connie could go to a better school and James could have more opportunities, and Sally herself could have something resembling a normal life. Sally didn't hear any of it. She was too busy to hear it, and not interested enough to listen if she hadn't been. Then in June, Earl Briggs came down from his hayloft wrong and shattered his left hip on the barn floor. He was 68 years old. The surgery at Huntsville Hospital went well. That the doctors said. The hardware went in clean, and there were no complications. But the recovery for a man his age was not a matter of weeks. He would not be back in anyone's field for the remainder of the season, possibly longer. Earl's daughter-in-law called Sally on a Tuesday evening to let her know. She was kind about it, apologetic in the way people are when they're delivering news that isn't their fault. Sally thanked her and said to please tell Earl she was glad the surgery had gone well, and that she'd come see him when he was ready for visitors. She hung up the phone and sat down at the kitchen table. She sat there for 10 minutes without moving. The kitchen was quiet. Connie was doing homework at the other end of the table and understood, from her mother's face, not to ask questions. James was in the other room. Outside, the light was going orange and low over the fields. Earl had been the one who knew what to do when something went wrong. He had been the person she called when she wasn't sure, the voice that told her what the problem was and how to address it. And now he was in a hospital bed in Huntsville with a shattered hip, and he was not coming back this season. The harvest was still coming. The cotton didn't care about any of it. Sally pushed back from the table, put on her boots, and went back out to the field. The cotton picker came in the first week of December, hired out from an operator in Lawrence County, who charged her a percentage of the crop. Sally walked the fields before he arrived, checking bowls, doing the mental arithmetic she had been doing since October. The yield came in at roughly 680 pounds per acre. Cotton was trading at 58 cents per pound. She ran the numbers at the kitchen table that night, the same kitchen table where Dennis Harwell had opened his folder 14 months earlier. Gross revenue, approximately $36,500. After operating costs, the picker's percentage, the monthly loan payments she had made without interruption since November of the previous year, and the property taxes she had paid in September. Net income for the year was $7,800. $7,800. For a year of work that had started at a graveside and moved through grief and drought, and a mentor's broken hip and more days of physical exhaustion than she could count. It was not much, it was barely enough. But it was positive, and positive meant she had survived year one. The years that followed tested every decision she had made and every sacrifice she had accepted in making it. 1989 brought a summer drought that arrived in July and didn't break until the cotton was already compromised. Her yield dropped by nearly a quarter. She made the payments anyway. 1990 brought softening cotton prices as global supply adjusted, and the market found a new floor below where it had been. She made the payments anyway. Then 1991 brought the regional agricultural credit crisis that closed 2 Limestone County banks and forced dozens of farm operations into emergency restructuring or outright failure. Sally read the foreclosure notices in the Limestone Democrat the way you read a casualty list. The Cagle family, who had farmed their ground for 3 generations, were gone. The Pruitt operation, whose north fence line ran along her south field boundary, was sold at a bank auction in March. The Whitfield brothers, whose father had sat next to Ray in the Elkmont First Baptist Choir for the better part of 20 years, lost everything by summer. She recognized every name. She had known these families her entire adult life. But Sally's costs were so low that she survived on revenue that would have been fatal to a farm carrying Ray's original debt structure. The Farmall's annual fuel expense ran under $140. Maintenance, which Sally now handled herself for most repairs after Earl had taught her what he knew and necessity had taught her the rest, averaged $480 per year. Her total equipment fixed costs across the 4 years never exceeded $1,200 in any single year. Ray's John Deere 4240 before he died had cost over $4,600 per year in fuel and loan payments alone. That figure didn't include a single dealer service call. Every month, $238 went to First Farmers Bank in Athens. Every month without exception, from November 1988 forward. Some months she mailed the check early, just to have it done. On a Wednesday morning in October of 1992, Sally D. Hudson drove north on 72 toward Athens with a check folded in the breast pocket of her work shirt. She had written it the night before at the kitchen table, same as she had written 47 checks before it. This one had a different quality to the writing. Her hand had been steadier than usual, or maybe less steady. She wasn't sure which. Dennis Harwell was at his desk when she came through the door. He saw her and stood up, which he hadn't done the first time she'd walked into his office 4 years earlier. He didn't hand her off to a teller. He processed the final payment himself, pulled the file, stamped it closed, and slid the paid-in-full documentation across the desk to her with both hands. Then he looked at her for a long moment. "Mrs. Hudson," he said, "I need to tell you something. When Ray passed and I came out to the farm and saw what you were facing, I did not think you were going to make it through the first year. I've been doing agricultural lending in this county for 19 years. I have never seen anyone do what you just did. Not once." Sally had thought about this moment before. She had imagined it on hard days in the field when she needed something to move toward. She had expected to feel triumph when it arrived. What she actually felt was closer to exhale. The release of something she had been holding in her chest for 4 years without fully realizing how heavy it was. "I didn't have a choice," she said. "I had kids, and I had land, and I just worked." Dennis shook his head slowly. "It's more than that," he said. "You had the discipline to live small when everything around you was failing big. That's not something most people can do." Sally picked up the paperwork and stood. "Mr. Harwell," she said, "I didn't care how it looked. I just cared about keeping what was mine." She drove home, pulled into the farmyard, and parked in the same spot she had parked every day for 20 years. Walked across the yard to the equipment shed. The Farmall Ford 50 sat where it always sat, rust-red and worn, grease-stained along the front axle where she had replaced the tie rod end herself the previous spring. The paint was no better than it had ever been. The hours on it were higher. It looked exactly like what it was. An old tractor that had been worked hard and maintained honestly and asked to do more than anyone thought it could. Sally put both hands flat on the hood, the way you'd put a hand on someone's shoulder. She said out loud, to no one in particular, "We made it." Maybe she was talking to the tractor, maybe to Ray, maybe to the 4 years of herself she had spent in that seat, in the red clay dirt, in the flat, overcast light of an Alabama morning when everything was harder than it should have been, and she did it anyway. She wasn't entirely sure, maybe all of it. The farm was hers, the land was still in the family, and the Farmall was still running. If Sally Hudson's story moved you, if you believe the lessons in it are worth preserving, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. This channel exists for stories exactly like this one, because the history of American farming is full of people who found a way through impossible years, and those stories deserve to be told. Every one of them.